Hey everyone. I'm Peter Fitch. I teach historical theology for St. Stephen's University graduate programs in theology and culture. I've been doing this since the program began in 1995. This is Module 3, and we focus on the time period of the Reformation up until the present day. And there's obviously so much to look at. We can't do it justice. So I'm just going to select ideas, thinkers, movements that I think are important for us to talk about. And my concern is to see the good and the bad, and hopefully we'll be able to learn from the past and to make better communities, do a better job at spiritual formation in our own lives and in our communities and for the future, for today and for the future. So I'd like to begin by talking about Martin Luther. And I thought that I could do this in one video, but I'm actually going to do it in two. So I'll have to change my class plan a little bit. I just found I've been reading Luther all summer. I just found too many things to say. So let's begin by screen sharing here. I'm going to work off this PowerPoint just for a few minutes, and then I'm going to turn to some notes that I've made. So I like the idea of bookending this this course in Module 3 with Martin Luther in 1500s and with Martin Luther King Jr. in the 20th century. Both of them are so influential, and their influence resounds, is reverberating still. We're touched by it deeply. So before I really get into the life of Martin Luther, though, I thought I'd review some of the key guiding principles for me in teaching of this material. And I've done that each one of the modules. So some of you will have heard this before. For others, it's the first time, I think. I really value the idea of an ancient future orientation. The idea that we look to the past to see what we shouldn't leave behind, to look for wisdom, but also to look for examples of terrible mistakes and errors and things that we really do want to leave behind. And so the idea is to prepare a better future by looking for the best questions that we can find coming out of the past. Another principle is from Jeremiah chapter 15, verse 19, and I really think of this as the founding verse for this entire program. Jeremiah is complaining to God, as he often does, and God answers him by saying, in the New American Standard Translation, he says, "If you return, then I will restore you. Before me you will stand. And if you can extract the precious from the worthless, then you'll be my spokesman." And I think of the first part of that as a function of the heart. If you return, then I will restore you. Before me, you will stand. To me, the idea of standing in the presence of God is not a small thing either. So it almost speaks of spiritual transformation, to become someone who could stand in the presence of God. But I really think that the second part is important, to extract the precious from the worthless. And when we're talking about religious history, or in really any form of cultural history, it seems to me that there's a lot of sifting that has to be done, a lot of filtering. So many things are taken for granted that are not necessarily wise or true. We need to learn to extract the precious from the worthless. To do this, I think we need what some of the postmodern philosophers have been crying out for. And I think ancient Christians understood the value of this as well. An epistemology of humility. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that has to do with how we know things. And I think we need an epistemology of humility. What it means is an open-handed approach to truth. Not being so certain, not being so sure that we have it nailed down or that we've understood everything. God is so big, how could we possibly understand it all? So an epistemology of humility is to come with the sense that this is the best that I can see so far. It might be true. Everything that we mean to do in this program is transformational education. The longing is that we would help people become the best leaders that they can be, to grow into their best selves. And this program, in a sense, was an alternative theology program. In the 90s, people were saying things like this. Well, John Wimber, who was a church renewal leader, eventually became the leader of the Vineyard movement, but was valued by Protestants and by Catholics around the world as a leader of church renewal. John Wimber said it just before he died in 1997. It seems as though the seminaries are producing researchers rather than spiritual leaders. We took that seriously. Also, Richard John Newhouse, I'm sorry, who was a Protestant thinker who had become a Roman Catholic, brilliant man, said that what is needed is not the training of religious technicians, but the formation of spiritual leaders. And so these were some of the key ideas. How can we make education serve this purpose of helping people become better leaders? And right away at the beginning, we thought one way was to include training in Ignatian spiritual direction. And fortunately, we had a spiritual director in our community, and over time we've had a few. And so this was something that we were able to offer. But we also thought that just about every class could serve this purpose as well, and especially it could do it if we used a method that I called 3-tiered conversations. That is, we would study great books together, the great books from the various periods of church history. But when we came together, we would bring the voice of the text, and we'd bring our own voice, because we would select the ideas that we thought were most important to talk about in each book. And then we would hope for a third voice, the voice of the Spirit of God, that would tie everything together, expose the really important points of meaning for each one of us, and just bring the conversation to life, put fire in our midst. So to do this and to do it well, we learned from Simone Weil. Another value emerges. She's the French genius that we speak about quite a bit in this program, because Brad loves her as well as I do, and or better. And she said, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And so we try to learn how to really listen to others, to really see others, to really see and understand the material that we're reading, to try to do it with generous eyes, and yet not naive eyes. And so all of this leading to a value of synergy. How can we learn from each other rather than just insisting or demanding that our way is right? How can we learn from each other? And probably the most important of these phrases for me, or these values, is the one that I call anchored with wings. And when I first heard this, it was one of our professors, actually now the president of our university, Dr. Margaret Ann Smith. And she was praying for our undergraduates as they were getting ready to step out into the world one year. And she said, "May you be anchored with wings." And I thought, what a wonderful phrase. And at the time, it seemed to me that it was saying, I hope that you're well grounded in a community. I hope that you're loved. I hope that you're known and loved. I hope that you are really, really connected. But on the other hand, I hope you have freedom to travel and to go to wherever your heart delights. Over time, this phrase became deeper for me too. I began to think of it as, I hope that you're rooted and grounded, anchored in the best of the values and beliefs that you've been reared in, that you've been trained in. I hope that you are rooted and grounded, and yet I hope that you have wings. I hope that you have wings enough to have a new thought, and not to feel that you're in prison to what you've been trained by. And so I really have come to value this thought, looking at it this way. A great benefit of this has been the capacity, it seems to me somewhere along the way, that we learned to value people that wanted to stay closer to the anchor of their tradition, and also to value people who wanted to fly a little further up into the sky. the people that wanted to remain more connected to what they had been taught in scripture or in their denomination, their particular church, as well as the people that wanted to chip away at that and to try to refine it and to create a better way to do things. So anchored with wings. So these are the guiding principles. And as Brad and I have talked about them, we think that they're not really just the principles for historical theology. In a way, they're principles for the entire program. I think that's enough of that. So let's get started on looking at Martin Luther. A door begins to open. The life and thought of Martin Luther. Luther lived from 1483 to 1546. And today, with my PowerPoint, I just want to give you a few visuals of some of the characters that are involved in his life. First, I'll just say that, there were some political precursors. John Wycliffe in England, who translated the scriptures into English, is somebody who was valued during his day as a university professor, but whose body was exhumed and he was discredited after he had died because he had questioned the authority of the church. John Ball, who was someone who had learned from Wycliffe, who didn't have exactly the same views, and Wat Tyler are people who used some of the ideas that grew out of Wycliffe's thinking, that really there should be equality of people, that a feudal system didn't make sense, to have a small group of aristocrats, nobles, governing huge masses of common people, who had very, very much less to live on, and the church in collusion with the higher powers. So John Ball and Wat Tyler were people in England who rose up against the feudal system and raised, inspired thousands of people to come against the aristocrats in certain cities and had some level of military success until it was put down. Often it was by promises from a king and allowing the people to disperse, at which time they were actually captured and executed by the soldiers. So there was a longing in the Middle Ages to break free from the feudal system. Another person who really lived through the same story is someone named Jack Cade. So revolution against the feudal system and ideas about reformation of the church happened in lockstep. Luther had a lot of precursors from an intellectual or a theological point of view. Meister Eckhart in the 1300s in Germany had a mystical understanding of the kind of knowledge that was worth having. And he was already taking stands that made the rest of the church look as though it wasn't really living up to its ideals. The Theologica Germanica was something that Luther fell in love with. It's a book that had been written by an anonymous author in the 1300s or the 1400s. I can't remember. And I think 1350, 14th century. And Luther found this book and realized that it said something very similar to the main idea that he rediscovered or discovered in Paul's writing, in St. Paul's writing, which was about justification by faith and how God's righteousness comes to us as a gift rather than something that we earn. So he loved this so much that as he published this book. And it's often called the Theologica Germanica of Martin Luther because he published it. Other medieval mystics were speaking about the equality of humans. In many nations, there was a call for the scriptures to be translated into the vernacular, not just left in Latin where highly educated people could look at it. In the Florentine Renaissance, there's a new love of Plato, and there's a rediscovery of some of the ancient art from the Roman Forum, and the focus becomes on the human being. And it's such an important thing to see in the development of art. I actually speak about it a little bit in Module 1. And while this is going on, it's as though there's an awakening to the importance of the human. And, and this is really going to be helpful, because when we have a feudal system in collusion with the church system, we have large powers that are highly authoritarian. And there has to be a sense that the human is important too, if we're going to break the power of those institutions. The Brethren of the Common Life, very pure-hearted group that had grown out in the lowlands. We studied them a little bit in module 2, and both Erasmus and Martin Luther were trained in schools that were sponsored by this group. And as Constantinople, the greatest Christian city for 1,000 years, had lost its influence, had fallen to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, some of the Eastern scholars were moving through Europe, and they were giving a return. People were getting interested once more in the ancient writers, and the focus on the ancient writers, as it had with the arts, was bringing a new confidence that there could be a better way to do things than had been done through the church age. Also, there's a prototype, and this prototype is a fascinating human named Jan Hus, who said 100 years before Luther a lot of the things that Luther said, and he was ultimately burned at the stake for it. 1369 or 1370 to 1415, he was promised safe conduct to a trial because of the things that he was suggesting, that the scriptures should be in check, that he was Czechoslovakian, that the scriptures should be in check, that men and women, that priests should be allowed to marry, that everyone should be able to have both communion elements. These are the priests didn't need to wear clerical garb, that the services should be in Czech and not in Latin. These are the kinds of things for which he was brought before a church tribunal, and also, of course, the idea that scripture was more important than the church in terms of authority, and so he was promised safe conduct, but people were so offended when they heard the things that he had to say that they reneged on that, and they decided to burn him at the stake. And Fox's Book of Martyrs records a very fascinating thing. This book was published in 1563 in England, and it has this to say about Jan Hus. When the faggots were piled up to his very neck, the Duke of Bavaria was so officious as to desire him to abjure. No, said Hus, I never preached any doctrine of an evil tendency, and what I taught with my lips, I now seal with my blood. He then said to the executioner, you are now going to burn a goose. And ironically, his name, Hus, signifies goose in the Bohemian language. But in a century, you will have a swan whom you can neither roast nor boil. And if he were prophetic, he must have meant Martin Luther, who shone about 100 years after, and who had a swan for his arms, his coat of arms. So this is kind of a fascinating prophecy. To me, I think it's possible that the Holy Spirit was whispering through him as he faced the culmination of his life in this very dramatic way. Luther's name originally was Ludger. It's a little hard to tell exactly what that means in German. Because it meant different things in different parts of the country. It could mean a military lieutenant. It could also mean a bitch. So it wasn't the nicest name. Luther had a great friend, Lucas Cranach Jr., and on the left we see a woodcut that he did of Luther when he was an Augustinian monk, and then much later in his life, a portrait that he did of him. He was involved in the messaging and all the marketing really that came out about the new ideas of the Reformation. The printing press had been established just 50 or 60 years before, and now there was a tool, and there was a way to communicate all these ideas. And the woodcuts and the volatile writings in German as well as Latin started to go all over Europe, and it created an incredible explosion. I always think it's so amazing to think who was the Pope that Luther is facing. It's Leo X, who's a great humanitarian in some ways. He's not the worst Pope by any means. He's a great spender. He loves art. He loves the arts. He loves parties. He loves in some ways a decadent life, but he is from the Medici family, the wealthiest family in all of Europe, the sponsors of art. And here is the aristocrat really against, Luther, who's from a mining background in Germany, really good peasant stock. Luther speaks of his background as being very humble. Actually, his father was an entrepreneur who had created quite a great life for the family. But still, it's peasant stock versus an aristocrat. And that plays a role too in understanding the conflict between Martin Luther and the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah, Pope Leo X had become a cardinal at age 13. This was the norm because there were great allowances, benefices that came from having a position in the church. And so the wealthy families established their children as having a role in the church. It had really nothing to do with piety. It just had to do with the fact that they would then be able to receive the allowances that came from the church-controlled lands. Here are some of the other people that are involved in this great story. I wonder if I can move that. So Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest scholar, appreciated all across Europe, writing in Latin and managing to stay within the Catholic Church, and yet speaking often of its need for reform and being appreciated by popes and kings, and because he said things brilliantly and he said things that most of them believed in. Most people knew that the church needed to reform. Spalatin, who was a friend of Luther's from school days, and who is going to be his link to Frederick the Wise, the elector over the part of Germany that they live in, and the person who is ultimately going to protect Luther. Philip Melanchthon, professor, brilliant young professor at the university, who is going to be the great support. Quiet, doesn't have Luther's bombastic personality, but he's the great support. He's the one who intellectually has rigor. He's going to be the one who writes the Augsburg Confession, which is presented in 1530, which is probably the founding creed, really, of Protestantism. Frederick III, Elector of Saxony, a woodcut done by Cranach, Lucas Cranach. He lived from 1463 to 1525. I've often thought, why did he have so much power to protect Martin Luther? It's so hard to believe that he would have this much power. He's, a fairly minor noble. Well, the reason is because there was, aside from the aristocrats that governed the small areas of each country, or the portions of each country, there was also the dream of a unified empire. And there was an election of the emperor. And there were only 7 people that had the right to make a vote. And Frederick III was one of them. So his vote is very important. He himself loved the idea of relics. And he had a collection of more than 19,000 relics. These were things in medieval practice. The idea was that there was a treasury of merit, that the saints that had gone on before had far more merit than they needed themselves to live beyond this life and live beyond a purgatory that would follow it. So they were received right into heaven, but their benefit remained in a kind of a treasury. And people could say a prayer in front of a relic, and they could have a moment of submission, and that this would somehow connect with the merit that was in the treasury of merit that had come from the great saints before. So relics weren't just historical. It was not just a museum piece. Relics were thought to be almost living things that connected you to a better future. They were sacred objects. And of course, the great fight with Martin Luther and the Roman Catholic Church starts because somebody comes, a man named Johann Tetzel, comes into their area. He's actually refused entrance into Frederick's area because, and what he's trying to do is to raise money for the building of St. Peter's in the Vatican, and so he's saying that if you give money to this building project, then you will be able to spend less time in purgatory. In fact, you can even free your relatives who've already gone before you into death. And so give us some money and you'll be able to escape from the torment of the purgatory that you might expect otherwise. Charles V. These are both pictures of Charles as a young man and then pictures of Charles later in life. He is the person who successfully becomes the Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. And he is, interestingly enough, his maternal grandparents are Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. They're the people in 1492 who sponsor Columbus's voyage that ultimately leads to North America and leads to the Americas. But they're also the people who in 1492 expelled all Jews and all Muslims from Spain unless they would convert. And the Spanish Inquisition played a large role at that time because some families said that they really had converted to Christianity, and then the Inquisition was there to see if that was true. One of the darkest periods in Christian history. Here are a few more characters. These are people that stood against Luther. Tetzel himself, Johann Eck, who was a scholar, Thomas Cajetan, who was a cardinal. These are people that Eck at Leipzig and Cajetan at Worms. These are people that who stand against Luther and demand that he recant from the writings and from the things that he's saying against the Roman Catholic Church. These are people who think that Luther is right and they want to go past Luther in their response. Andreas Karlstadt, who taught at the university with Luther, and Thomas Müntzer, and with another group of people called the Zwickau Prophets. These are people who become political revolutionaries. Karlstadt will get started in that direction. Müntzer will go much further. So these are some of the characters, and I've asked you to look at the movie that was made in 2003 called Luther, and I don't know that it's historically perfect, but I think it's very good at helping the imagination to appreciate all of these things. So the whole story, there's a great story to be told here. One of the greatest people in the story is Katharina von Bora, who lived from 1499 to 1552. And she was a nun, and so many nuns and monks thought that Martin Luther was right as he gradually began to write against the church. And they thought that they wanted to escape from their lives in convents and in monasteries. And Katharina and some others were helped to escape from a convent the mythology is that they actually got into herring barrels, but probably they were just on the wagon that the herring barrels were on, and they were brought to Wittenberg, where Luther was teaching at the university, and where this all began, and in Frederick the Wise's territories, and it's almost like it becomes the center of the world. It's the center of the Reformation. Students are coming, they want to be taught with the new learning, and so much is being published and is being sent out around the world, and people everywhere are listening. It's just a remarkable thing. And Katharina von Bora is the person who ultimately lands Luther. She has several people. I think there are just two really, Luther and one of his friends, that she says she's willing to marry. They're helping all of the nuns to find a husband, which is such a revolutionary thought. And she says she'll take his friend or she'll take him. And he didn't think he had time to be married. He was running a revolution, but ultimately he does marry her in 1525. And they have a really, in many ways, they have a sweet and lovely domestic life. Okay, yeah, just maybe a few more words from this part of the teaching. The time was right. There was a lot that was wrong about the feudal system, not only the church, but also the governing system. But there's a lot that's wrong in the church as well. And there was a real sense in Germany that frustration that so much money was leaving Germany and going to Italy to build, these monuments, these huge buildings for the Vatican. Also, at the same time, remember 1453, Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Empire. And so gradually the Ottoman Empire is encroaching into the rest of Europe. And there is a need for Catholics to work together with Protestants to stop the Muslim conquest of Europe. You could say, why is Martin Luther successful? Why is he able to do what Wycliffe couldn't? And part of the answer is that the emperor and his armies had to be focused on some internal battles, that he had issues going on in France, but also he had to put his focus at stopping the Ottoman Empire from coming in and through into the rest of Europe. Will and Ariel Durant wrote The Story of Civilization. It's a multi-volume history of the world up to their time. And he said 1,000 factors and influences, ecclesiastical, intellectual, emotional, economic, political, moral, were coming together. The time was right. Okay. So I think I will leave off at this point talking from this PowerPoint. And I think I'm just going to start to share a timeline that I developed. I found myself reviewing so many church histories and so many, and a lot of Luther's writing that I've read over the years. And I read too much for this one and got myself in trouble because in the end it became probably the most difficult one so far of these videos to make. But I'm going to try to share a different thing right now, my notes and a timeline that I've developed from sort of piecing all these things together. Well, that doesn't help. Okay. So, yeah, 1436, the invention of movable type, a printing press by Johannes Gutenberg. This is going to play such a major role in the changing consciousness of Europe. 1483, November 10th, Hans and Margaret Luther at Eisleben give birth to a boy named Martin. Well, in fact, they name him Martin. I'll tell you why in a minute. Later, he will change his name based on the Greek word eleutheros, meaning free one. And as his reputation increases and they also join with him, they're going to change their name to follow. So they go from Luther to Luther. In 1483, on November the 11th, so the day after Martin Luther is born, he's baptized. And it's the Western feast day of St. Martin of Tours. And he is given his name, and apparently this was a normal custom, to take the name of the person whose feast day it was. So in a fascinating irony of history, it turns out that it was at a battle at a place called Borba Tomagus, which is now Worms, that St. Martin of Tours, but while he was a Roman soldier, before he became the great church father, took his own historic stand at about 356 when he said, I can no longer fight. I'm a Roman soldier, but I can no longer fight. He said, "I am the soldier of Christ. It is not lawful for me to fight." He was charged with cowardice and imprisoned, but he offered to go to the front of the battle unarmed, demonstrating that he wasn't a coward. And apparently they were going to allow this to happen, but the battle was suddenly called off, and he was released from prison and ultimately released from military service. So isn't it ironic that Martin of Tours gives his name to Martin Luther, and that Martin will take a historic stand at a city called Worms, but it's the same place where St. Martin of Tours had a historic stand, a great stand of courage. This is the place where we think Martin Luther said the most famous words, "Here I stand, so help me God, I can do no other," when Cardinal Cajetan is insisting that he retract his writings, and he says that he won't do it. "Here I stand, so help me God, I can do no other." Although actually, these words weren't in the original transcript; they were added later. In a moment, I'll read you the original transcript. We don't know if this is a correction, so if somebody forgot this part, or if it was an addition that was added later. But these are probably the most important words that we associate with Martin Luther. "Here I stand, so help me God, I can do no other." And it happened at the city of Worms, at a diet of Worms, when the emperor had convened a diet, a governance meeting, and in 1521, and they bring Martin Luther to it, and Cardinal Cajetan insists that he retract his works, and he says that he won't, after taking a day to think about it. So in the very same place, years before, his namesake had taken a historic stand at the same place. I love these little connections. 1501, Luther studies at the University at Erfurt, 70 or 80 miles away, I think, from Eisleben. 1505, he receives an MA in philosophy. He enters law school. He's in a terrible storm, cries out to St. Anne, the protector of miners, in a bad storm, and he promises to become a monk if she saves his life. And he takes it seriously. A couple of his classmates had just died of the plague. He himself had had a close call with an accident with a sword. Life was fragile, and he was afraid in the storm, walking back to the university. 1508, Luther begins study and duties as a lecturer at the University of Wittenberg, where his Augustinian mentor, he's become a monk, and Johann von Staupitz is his mentor. He has become the dean of the theological faculty at Wittenberg. He's a childhood friend of Frederick the Wise, and Frederick wants to have a university. He's got other electors, other nobles have universities. He wants one too, and so he's invited Staupitz to be the dean. And Staupitz cares a lot for Luther and has great respect for his potential, and he brings him on as a lecturer at the university. In 1510 or 1511, Staupitz chooses Martin and another monk to go to Rome. They walk the 1,000 miles there and back, 1,000 miles there, 1,000 miles back, to make an appeal concerning a governance matter among the Augustinians. They go through Florence about 12 years after the burning of Savonarola. So they would have seen Michelangelo's David in the main piazza. I think that's fascinating. In 1512, Staupitz chooses Martin to replace him as professor of Bible, just 2 days after Martin Luther receives his doctorate. In 1515, Erasmus publishes a Greek New Testament. In 1517, it all comes down. October the 31st, offended at Tetzel's preaching of indulgences, Luther posts the 95 Theses on the door of the castle church at Wittenberg in Latin. And this was actually not an act of rebellion. It was a normal thing for scholars engaged in theological disputes. However, the 95 Theses were translated into German, and they were printed and spread quickly, igniting the beginning of the Reformation. Some people think that it's more likely that Luther sent the 95 Theses to Albrecht of Mainz than that he nailed them to the door. Luther didn't know that Albrecht was dependent upon Tetzel's success. He had become Archbishop of Magdeburg in 1513 at the age of 23. He was also Bishop of Halberstadt, but now there was an opening to become Archbishop of Mainz in 1514, and he wanted it, but it was against ecclesiastical law to have more than one diocese. So he made a deal with Leo X, the Pope, for 24,000 ducats, with the understanding that the Fuggers, a banking family, would pay this to the Vatican, and then Albrecht would raise money to repay the Fuggers by the sale of indulgences. Half would go to Albrecht for the loan, half would go to Leo for the building of St. Peter's Church. So Tetzel comes close to Frederick's area. Some of Luther's people, he's operating as a university professor, but he's also preaching, and he hears that some of the parishioners have fallen for this kind of thing. They've gone off to these meetings and they think that their relatives are being released from purgatory because they've given some money to the building project. So Luther thinks that if the Pope hears about this, he'll be as shocked as he is, and it's highway robbery, and so he writes the 95 Theses, and in them, and I'm going to point this out again in the PowerPoint when we come back to that next time, but he makes the comment: if the Pope really has the ability to free people from purgatory, why doesn't he do it for the sake of holy love, not for building programs? So anyway, that this is what sets it all off. This is the fuse, and he doesn't realize that Albrecht needs Tetzel to be successful. He's got to raise them. He wanted to have more than one of these, he wanted to be Archbishop of Mainz, as well as the other church offices that he already held. And he couldn't do it without giving lots of money to the Vatican. And so he didn't have that much money, so he has to repay the banking family. So half of the money raised by Tetzel is going to go to Albrecht, and the other half is going to go to St. Peter's directly. In 1518, Luther appears before Cardinal Cajetan at the Diet of Augsburg, and he's ordered to submit. Cajetan has orders to arrest him if he refuses, but Luther's helped to escape under cover of darkness. And then there's an extended debate in 1519. Luther, along with Karlstadt, really it's Karlstadt who starts it, debate Eck, who is an academic, faithful to the Catholic Church. And he really gets Luther to, when Luther can't stop himself from saying the same kind of thing that John Hus said: a council may sometimes err. Neither the church nor the Pope can establish articles of faith. These must come from Scripture. Eck realized that he had Luther where he wanted him, clearly following in the footsteps of Jan Hus and on the path toward excommunication. Hus had been promised safe conduct to a trial 100 years earlier, but this was revoked when he appeared, and he'd been burned at the stake because he had challenged the authority of the church. Now Luther was doing the same thing. In 1520, June 15th, Leo X issues a papal bull, Exsurge Domine, giving Luther 60 days to recant or be excommunicated. Luther decided to make his case to the German people with 3 books published in quick succession. The first is Address to the Nobility of the German Nation in August of 1520. The second is The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. This one is October the same year. And the third one is The Freedom of a Christian Man, November. And this one was in Latin and in German. The second one was just in Latin. Some main ideas include, of all 3, just merging them together. Some main ideas include Germany's wealth being drained by Italy, the corruption of the church, the authority of Scripture, the only true sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist, not the 7 that the church was proclaiming, the nature of the Eucharist, and a conciliatory appeal to Leo X. And that's in the last book in particular, The Freedom of a Christian Man. And he does this with, it's actually surprising. There's been a good deal of back and forth and a lot of animosity, but suddenly he's just writing to Leo so beautifully, as though he's his father, the Pope, and he wants to be in submission to him. And he's saying, Luther, dear Pope Leo, you must stand against these terrible things which are in the church, not realizing that, Leo would like to see some reform too, as all intellectuals at the time would, but he also is dependent upon the building programs and all the wealth coming in for all the spending that he wants to do on art. So in December the 10th, Luther burns the papal bull and lots of other books beside Roman Catholic books. He does it with students and with other supporters roundabout. In 1521, on January the 3rd, Luther is excommunicated, officially excommunicated. In April, he appears at the Diet of Worms, where he refuses to recant with the following famous words. So this is what is included in the actual transcript from 1521. Since then, your serene majesties and your lordships seek a simple answer, I will give it in this manner, plain and unvarnished. Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the scriptures or clear reason, for I do not trust in the Pope or in the councils alone, since it is well known that they often err and contradict themselves. I am bound to the scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not retract anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen. In May the 5th, Charles, who, as I said, his maternal grandparents were Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, issues the Edict of Worms, calling him a heretic and criminal, making it an offense to help him in any way. However, Frederick had already arranged for his kidnapping on the way home from Worms, and he was at Wartburg Castle for the next 11 months, translating the New Testament into German, pretending to be a knight, Junker George, with his tonsure gone and with a full beard. And this is why he's able to live. It's because there's Frederick in the background who is valued because of his vote in terms of choosing the emperor, but he is strong enough to be able to stand against the emperor in certain instances. And in this case, he's just going to quietly arrange for Luther to be kidnapped and taken really to safe passage in the Wartburg Castle. And I think that's enough for this first one. I'm gonna speak more about Luther, and unfortunately, I'm gonna speak more about his failings in the next video. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about a very, very strange symmetry that I see. It seems to me that there was a lovely symmetry with Martin of Tours and Martin Luther, in that they both took a heroic and courageous stand at the same place. There's another connection that's much darker that I want to show in the next video. So that's all for today. Bye now.